Hi there, and a very warm welcome to this week's Quick Tip. I'm still calling them Quick Tips, but I think they rather deserve the name tutorial. I think in my brain I just want to make something different, so I think I keep calling them Quick Tips, whether they are long or not. If you have any suggestion for another name, just let me know in the comments. Speaking of comments, let this commence. Now, we are talking about render layers. This is not to be confused with multipasses. While render layers encapsulate multipasses, or AOVs as the more modern kids say, render layers is a special technique inside of the AOV system to split one object or a group of objects from the rest of the scene, while you get the impact of the object on the scene in other passes. And I'm speaking of the diffuse, the reflection, and the shadow that the object casts on the other objects of the scene. And you can see a little bit of that in the preview that is looping in the background right now. As I say, week for week now, this is about to be a short one, but let's see how long it takes in the end. I'm afraid to say it's under 10 minutes, so probably it's not. Let's go. Inside of Cinema 4D, I have modeled an object. This is still work in progress, but I think it's good enough to show it to you, and it has an interesting shape with holes and everything in it. So I thought it lends itself very well to demonstrate the render layer. I think the biggest use case of render layers is when the client you have tells you he wants the product you have on a white background or any uniform colored background. So instead of using a material here, you would use just a simple white color. To do this in one scene would be that you could not bring the color up from the material to a white color so it is uniformly white on the scene without overexposing and looking crappy because you have blown out highlights. So what we are going to do is to isolate the object from the background and then get special passes for the shadow, the reflection and the diffuse to later on comp that together and do our corrections there. So let's show you where to find the render layers. To go there, you need to open up the render settings, then go to Octane render and then to the render AOV group. And if you look down here, you can see there's the render layers. So this is a set of rules we now can apply. Let's show you. If I enable the render layers, you see that everything's gone now. And this is because the render layers are defined by the render ID. So the render ID is basically telling the render layers here what's visible and what's not. So what we can do is go back to our object here and give this a Octane render tag, because in the render tag we are going to apply the ID. And in the tag under object layer you can see the layer ID. And if I set this to 2, so those are matching, you can see our object is now showing up as a separate object in our render view. But don't be fooled, the rest of the scene is still there, it's just invisible for the camera. And I can show it to you if I go to my backdrop here and disable it. You can see that the reflection now looks totally different because now it's turned off for real. And now it's turned on again and you can see the backdrop is reflecting inside of the object. Now I will mention one thing real quick, and sometimes you have set your object IDs in different tags and have different IDs for different use cases. So you can't just adjust them to one common number that is overall the same. So what you could do is leave that as the number 1, so everything vanishes again, and give the backdrop another Octane object tag here. And give that the layer ID 2. Now we have the whole thing reversed where the backdrop is showing up but the machine here is cut out. But what we could do now is to invert our render layer to make our machine show up again. What this enables us to do is use different tags here with different numbers. As long as you leave out the number 2, you can use all different numbers. If you go to 2, of course the machine vanishes here, but if you go to any other number, 3 or 4, and there's some update issues again, so I will just hide and unhide the machine real quick. You can see it is showing up, and so if you have any effect that is reliant on the layer ID, you can still use render layers, have different IDs on your machine, while still having the system intact. As you can see, we only have our object right now, so what's missing is the shadows, the reflection and the diffuse on our scene. So let's bring this in by going into the render AOV manager here. And what we are going to do is search for layer. And this is really convenient since the layer here is also reflected in the layer of the passes we are searching or the AOVs we are searching. So just double click on layer shadows, layer reflection and layer black shadows. Alright, so now that we've added that in, let's close our render AOV manager and let's see what the system has come up with. With the black layer shadows, you have a transparent shadow pass now from the object to the environment. So basically from everything that is inside of the render layer to everything that is not included in the render layer. And we have the same for the reflections. So we have the object reflecting on the environment. And then there is the layer shadow, which is the same with the layer black shadow, but it can hold colored reflections, for example, from objects that are translucent or transparent with a certain color. But as a disadvantage, you lose the transparency. But to be honest, that shouldn't matter much because in your compositing app, you're going to multiply that over the background and therefore you shouldn't have any problems with a path that doesn't have transparencies. So now that we've seen that, let's go over the different modes here real quick. So the mode that is set normal, that means we can get our product and our shadows within one path. But as you might have guessed, you can do a multiple render setup where you have, for example, the hide inactive layers. And this only makes our main object available and we don't get any sort of side effects from it on the background. You can also see that I have my screw original geometry down here. So in contrast to what the other method is doing, you don't get the parts that are not visible cut away by the matte here anymore. So you just see your normal object as is. Then we have only side effects. And if we go into the shadow, you can see that pretty clearly. So right now the object is missing and we are just getting the whole shadow of the object. That might be necessary if your object is partly translucent or something like that and you want just the whole shadow pass here. The same of course goes for the reflection. You can see that the object is just invisible and you can see through the object while it wasn't possible when the mode was set to normal. Okay, last but not least, we have hide from camera. This almost gives us the same as the first hide inactive layers, but the layers are just hidden from the camera. So you can see that for the screws here, the screws are shadowed by the plane here, but they are still visible and not cut away. So if I go to hide the layers here again, you can see the screws have more reflections here, because the inactive objects are just turned off completely. And with hide from camera, they are just turned off from the camera. But for our little example, we are going with the normal mode and therefore get the screws cut out and get our shadows and reflections. Now, since I don't need the shadow twice, let's go with the black shadow and let's go and delete the layer shadows out of our render AOVs here. Before we render, there's a couple of things I want to emphasize, and one of this is in the new Octane version, so we are in the 2022.1 version, they switched the pre-multiplied alpha section from the camera imager where it was before to the render settings. And I think that's a good thing, because you would expect it here more than in the camera imager. But the new default in the pre-multiplied alpha was linearized, and it should be on none. At least if you want the old behavior of a straight alpha. And I find that especially with those scenes that are really dependent on very accurate alphas, that having the alpha set to straight or none in this case is a much better deal. I think the settings default might change in the future to none again, so we don't have a discrepancy between the old Octane's behavior and the new ones as a default. For now, you just have to remember to set it to none from linearized. Next thing, we want to linearize our color space too, so we go to linear sRGB here. Because, as you know me, I am doing everything in linear color space until the end product is comped out. And finally, the last step before rendering, going to the render AOVs again, make sure you have them enabled, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see the passes here anyway. Then again, go to EXR Octane, go to DWAB compression. As I said multiple times before, I find that a very good solution, has very small file sizes and gives you very good quality still. And then, dependent on your needs, I like to see my passes in the render view, and I always save the beauty here and not through the Cinema 4D saving option. So I only have to save it in one directory and don't have to care about different passes set everywhere. Also, again, as always, I don't like to render multi-layer files. This is a personal preference. You can do so if you want. Small insert here, sponsored by Chart Time. So I've made a chart here which shows the advantages and disadvantages of the Octane output versus the Cinema 4D output. This is very similar to last week's chart. So what I'm going to emphasize here is that our shadows have a different alpha from our main object. And this is not possible to put out with the Cinema 4D output method. So you need to use the Octane output on this one, at least if you want to have a different alpha on your shadow. If you're using the layer shadows, you just can multiply that path over your image and therefore don't need an alpha. Okay, so let's hit render and then go over to comp. By the way, I get this a lot, so if you have the render going and you see those jagged edges here, those are because of the straight alpha. So what's happening here is that information of the picture, especially in the areas where you have depth of field, is integrated into the beauty. So it looks like it's fully there, but then later on it's cut away by the alpha. So if I go to layers and we look at the alpha, you can see the alpha has the right transparency and it doesn't look jagged, at least if I go to 100% here. So what's happening is that the beauty, so to speak, overprovides until the very edge of the object, and then this is cut away by the alpha. And this is a good way to provide a very clean alpha that doesn't need to be pre-multiplied or anything, because the information that is cut away is just from the object and not the object and the background combined. Okay, next, let's go into compositing. Inside of After Effects, let's first go over the project settings. Open that here. So you have to make sure we are going to be in 32-bit and the profile is sRGB. Then further down, we have to check linearize because we are working in a linearized color space. I usually would have done that in ACES, but ACES is a bit more convoluted, and to keep it simple, I opted for a linearized sRGB workflow. So now that we've checked if our settings are correct, let's bring in our images that we've just rendered. Here we go. Let's import all of those, and then go for the main and drag that into the comp here. As we've checked the pre-multiplied to none, that means it's unpremultiplied or straight. We have to set that in our image sequences in After Effects. So let's go to our image here and choose Interpret Footage, Main. and make sure this is set to straight. There might not be a big difference here, but depending on your renderer, you can have black outlines or any artifacts on the rim of your alpha, and this avoids that. Since our shadow is also an alpha image, we want to do the same here on the shadows too. What you could do if you have more images, you can go to one where you set your settings and remember interpretation, and then choose all the other images and set apply interpretation. And that then takes care of everything. What I want to do next is setting up a comp, so I'm just going the main, drag it into the comp here, and now we've created a comp, and then create a layer as a solid to act as our background. Here we go. And it could be black because we are going to use the tint effect on it to make it whatever color we want. Right, let's get it underneath the object here. And then I'm using Andrew Kramer's effects console and getting a tint effect in here. Here we go. So for example, we want to make this white. Now let's have a look at our reflection and shadow path. So if I go to the reflection here, you can see the image is very dark. Notice that the reflection not only includes the reflection itself, but also the diffuse, and also would include the caustics. To be honest, I think those are caustics from the stems here. If that looks a little bit noisy, don't be worried. This is an extreme example. If you have a completely black floor, you would need to add more samples there. But since we are dealing with a white floor or a gray floor, this is fine. Now let's look at our shadows here, and they're looking as we have seen in the renders. So what we could do now is go back to our main comp here and add our shadows first. Here we go. They belong underneath of the object. If you're not satisfied with the strength of the shadow, you of course are able to dial in the strength here. And if you want to have them stronger, obviously you can use a curse. And then go for the alpha here and make the alpha stronger. The only thing you have to watch out for is the super saturation here, where you then get only a black color. So what I usually do is just adjust the gamma if you want to have stronger shadows. But be careful, this can easily break the realism of your comp. So let's turn off or delete the curse for now, and let's go with our reflection. And I usually bring the reflection in atop of the shadow here. And of course, this then overrides everything, but a reflection always needs to be added. So let's go to the add mode here. And now you don't see the reflection anymore because our background is white. And if you add something on white, then of course it's gone. But you would still see it in the shadows. So if the shadow was tweaked differently and was going in front of the object, then you would be able to see the reflection in the shadow a little bit. The alternative here is to not opt for a white background, but for a gray one, or even get a gradient in the background here. We can try this real quick. So we are getting a gradient ramp, and then just invert that, swap colors. And instead of black, let's go for a gray value here, maybe a 40% gray. And you can see now that this value is gray. You can start to see the reflection here. And if the reflection is still too weak for you, you can obviously do stuff as duplicating the reflection layer, and therefore getting a little bit of a stronger reflection here. And obviously you are free to do any more corrections here too. For example, in our main layer, bring in the curves again and get this a little bit lighter with some contrasty vibes in the dark tones. Something like this maybe. Here we go. So it looks a bit better. And obviously, if the client says, oh, we don't want to have a white background anymore, now we should have a red background, you can change this really easily by going in and set the background, for example, to a red background. and then you have overall the red color that the client specifies with your object in it. Of course, the reflection of the floor on your object is still going to be white because the floor in the original render was white. So this is something you need to look out for. But overall, this is a very flexible and handy method to do product visualizations. And obviously, you can also use that in your VFX projects. So instead of having a one colored background, you can also use a photograph and then match the surrounding scene to what's on your photograph and have your object cast shadows on the different objects around it. And then if you match that really closely, can sit your object in your photograph, and if you're good, nobody notices that it's CG. And this again concludes this week's tutorial. I hope again you liked it and you learned something. If you have any ideas for following tutorials, please write that in the comments below or message me anywhere on social media. Since it's the holiday season, I have an invite for next week, so I can't be here recording tutorials on Sunday, unfortunately. So I'm not sure if I can make a tutorial next week. So it really depends on how much work I have to do during the week if I can squeeze one in and then post it on Sunday. I think that's all for this week. Thank you again for staying with me that long. And that leaves me with my famous last words. Have a great time and happy render layering. Bye.